Good morning and welcome to AM Agenda. 78 asylum seekers remain in limbo this morning on board an Australian customs vessel off the coast of an Indonesian province after more than 10 days at sea. The local Indonesian governor says his islands should not be a dumping ground for other countries. Is the Indonesian solution failing for the government? Joining me this morning to discuss this and the other matters of the day, the government's Parliamentary Secretary for Employment and the Shadow Minister for Small Business, Scott Morrison and Jason Clare. Gentlemen, good morning to you.
I've replaced Showboat.
Oh, sorry, have I just...
you got the wrong position.
That's right. I've stuffed that.
It's a promotion for him.
Parliamentary Secretary for Employment, Jason Clare, Shadow Housing Minister, I should say, Scott Morrison. The auto cue's playing up.
No problem.
Jason, let me ask you first of all, on a serious note, this solution, you know, it does seem to be becoming a bit of a debacle. These 78 asylum seekers at sea for more than 10 days now.
This situation's pretty unique and very complicated because these asylum seekers were identified not in Australian waters, not in Indonesian waters either. You made the point this morning, in that safety and rescue zone. Australia was asked to come to the aid, to come to the rescue of a boat that was in distress by the Indonesians, which we did. Indonesia didn't have an obligation to take the asylum seekers, but have decided to do so. That still stands. Where we're at the moment is the Australian government and the Indonesian government, their officials, working out the disembarkation of those people at that port. Now, it's complicated and unique because it's not Australian or Indonesian waters, so you're not going to see this situation come up all the time. But the point to make here is that the solution to dealing with these challenges is working with our neighbours, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and working with the problem at its source, which is, in this case, Sri Lanka. You've got 250,000 refugees in a refugee camp in Sri Lanka. Australia has made the point very strongly to Sri Lanka that those people need to be resettled. Last week we saw, I think, 4,000 to 6,000 people resettled out of those camps. That's a start, but there is still a long way to go. The Sri Lankan government has won the war. They've got to win the peace here as well, and that means making sure there is a place in Sri Lanka for everyone, including the Tamil population.
Scott, is it fair to say, as Jason has said, and indeed as the Foreign Minister has said again this morning, that this is a one-off case because of where these people were intercepted in international waters, the Indonesian rescue zone as it's called, but they're saying it's not going to happen on a regular basis because it wasn't in either Indonesian or Australian waters?
Well, the government doesn't know that. The government has an excuse for every boat. We've got 45 boats, 2,069 people. They're coming to Australia. They're wanting to come to Australia. The government has softened the border protection laws. That's why they're coming to Australia. And we've got these asylum seekers literally out at sea. Literally out at sea, as is the government's policy. It's complete chaos. Now, what we've been asking question time all week, though, is what did the Prime Minister know? When did he know it? And he's had a complete memory lapse. It's all gone. We've asked him to come back into the House and explain to us again, well, when did you know? And he goes, well, I just don't know. I can't remember. Lots of things are going on. It's a very fluid environment. And that's not good enough. The Prime Minister has to answer these questions in the House today, and he needs to be accountable for why his border protection policies have clearly failed. The other point I was making, there is no Indonesian solution. We shouldn't describe it as an Indonesian solution because there is no solution in it. And the people who know that better than anyone are the 78 asylum seekers sitting out at sea.
Jason, the government has repeatedly said that it wants to work with regional partners. The Prime Minister was at the inauguration of the President last week and so on. But it doesn't seem to be working. As much as you want to cooperate, and as much as people are saying it's bad weather and so on that's stopping this boat from docking, the governor says he doesn't want his islands to be treated as a dumping ground. It sounds like it's much more complex than is being portrayed.
The first point is it is working, and you see the evidence of the work between Indonesia and Australia over a long period of time, and it was under the Howard government. Well, under this criteria. The arrest and prosecution of people smugglers in Indonesia that happened through the AFP and Indonesian officials working together.
That's not the measure.
The second measure would have to be the number of boats that are intercepted and stopped before they ever set to sea. Something like 80 boats in the last 12 months.
Get here?
Well, Unfortunately,
That's
under the
not the
Howard
case.
government, a lot of boats ended up on Australia's shore and people walking around on the sand.
Under the Howard government, we went to zero.
Well,
Zero, mate.
Zero. I think that might have been because
That was
the
our policy.
Taliban were overthrown.
Oh, right.
Might have
Okay.
something
So
to do with
it was
Taliban.
push factors then, it's push factors now. We
Well,
took it to zero. The Australian people know
As I said,
your policy
as
is
I
in chaos.
as I said last week, and I make the point again, a war in Sri Lanka has ended in the last 6 months. When wars like this end, people tend to flee. The same thing happened at the end of the Vietnam War. Now, no one blamed the Fraser government for that. It is the same situation now.
Okay.
And can I make this point
I want
about
to ask you about the conditions, though, at the detention centres, because, you know, the Labor opposition, when you're in opposition, were very critical of children being kept in detention. Now, we're seeing images of some of these Indonesian detention centres that are quite appalling. What will the government say if children end up behind razor wire in Indonesia? How can you just say it's a matter for them when the Prime Minister's got on the phone and asked them to take these people?
My understanding this morning is that the people that are on this boat, once they're disembarked, that there'll be an opportunity for the children and for the women to be housed in alternative accommodation. I think, and the government believes, that it's important that the conditions in those detention centres in Indonesia are as good as possible. That's why the Howard government funded the development and support for detention centres. This detention centre was built by the Howard government. That's why we fund the UNHCR, to make sure that the detention, the processing and the resettlement of these people meets international standards. That's the right thing to do. It's the approach that was taken by both governments, both political persuasions.
It was established by the Howard government, so the idea that it's this solution created by the Rudd government to fund processing in Indonesia is a fallacy.
Look, we built Christmas Island, and the Labor Party called it a white elephant. We had a solution in the Pacific, and we put funds into
Why
that,
did you build Christmas
and
Island?
people were put there, and they were dealt with humanely. So, look, the government's policy is in chaos. I think that's clear. They're throwing around this hope of an Indonesian solution, which is not coming off. And what happens to those asylum seekers and how they're treated in Indonesia is on Kevin Rudd's watch, and he'll need to be accountable.
I'm going to move on. There's a number of other issues I want to get to today. Emissions trading debate continuing today starting for the second time. It could be the trigger for the double dissolution election. It comes as the Prime Minister is asked by the Danish Prime Minister to be one of his supports in the Copenhagen negotiations. Is that going to be a help or a hindrance for Kevin Rudd? Has it raised expectations for what can be achieved by him and the Copenhagen summit?
Well, I think it shows that Australia can have an influence over international negotiations. There's been this argument by the Liberal Party that Australia doesn't matter when it comes to negotiations at an international level. I think this proves that that's not correct, and that Kevin Rudd and the Australian government will have an important role at Copenhagen. Tony Abbott made the same point in an article that he wrote last week, where he said Australia acting today, passing the carbon pollution reduction scheme, will help the negotiations.
But has it raised the stakes for Kevin Rudd? Does he have more ownership of it now?
Well, I think Australia understands that we are the hottest and the driest country in the world. We have a big stake in a success at Copenhagen. That's why we need to make sure that the world acts.
The negotiations continue, Scott, on the emissions trading scheme. You want agriculture excluded from that scheme.
That's right.
Do you think that the government will do that? It looks like they will.
Well, look, we're not going to provide a running commentary on the negotiations, obviously, but if there is a change to how agriculture is treated, it will be because the coalition championed it. It will be because the Liberal Party has raised these matters strongly, arguing for agriculture to be excluded. I remember on this program just a few weeks ago when Tony Burke was on, I said, Tony, you could remove agriculture today from this scheme. Now, we're in negotiations now, but going into this Copenhagen summit, we have given the government support for their targets, and we gave that to them some time ago. We are negotiating on the ETS. Whether Kevin Rudd gets a warm, fuzzy feeling about getting a cuddle at a conference from the chair is, frankly, I know he's more interested in these things than other matters, but I don't think it makes much difference.
Kieran, irrespective of what happens at Copenhagen, we know that we're going to be living in a world where carbon is constrained in the future. And business understands that as well. They want to know the rules about how it will work so they can make long-term decisions for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. That's why the legislation that we're debating today is so important. Australia wants us to act. They don't want more delay. Business wants the laws passed this year, and hopefully, bit of good faith, both parties working together, we can get there in the interest of Australia.
Let's take a break. After the break, we'll look at the cost of the Governor-General's trip to Africa earlier in the year. Stay with us.